They once stood side by side, Gall and Sitting Bull, bound by battle, blood, and the dream of freedom. But exile has a way of changing men, of testing convictions, of dividing even the strongest bonds. In the cold wind of the north, with the buffalo vanishing and the people growing thin, hard choices had to be made. And when two leaders see different paths, only one can be followed. This is not a story of betrayal, it's a story of burden, of what it costs to lead when the old world begins to die. This is Chronicles of the Old West, Episode 6 on the life of Gall, Lakota war chief.
It was in the time after the great victory, when the dust of long hair's fall had not yet settled, and the hearts of the people were still filled with thunder. But that thunder would soon turn to silence. The Wasatches, the Long Knives, came harder than before. They built new forts on the old buffalo paths. Their wagons carried food not for the people, but for soldiers. Their treaties were wind, and so the Hunkpapa Lakota and others from the northern tribes followed the buffalo north across the line that men drew on paper and called a border, though no border exists in the heart of the earth. They went into grandmother's land, what the red-coated ones called the Queen's Country, into the wide plains of Saskatchewan. Among them was Gall. He had stood at Little Bighorn beside Sitting Bull. He had led men with fury and with sorrow, but now he led them into exile, not in glory, but in hunger. It was early in the moon of green grass when Sitting Bull, at the head of 135 lodges, made his way along the White Mud River. The people called it Frenchman's Creek. It flowed near the Cypress Hills, through land where buffalo still ran. This was the place where Four Horns and Black Moon had already raised their lodges near Wood Mountain. They said that land seemed like a promise. The grass rolled like waves in all directions. Buffalo still breathed there. The sun was wide and the wind kind, and at first the people believed they had found rest. But even there, in the north, the Wasatchew Law came riding. He was called Walsh, Major James Walsh, of the Redcoats, the mounted police. His people called him White Forehead for the shine of his helmet and the pale skin beneath it. But we called him Long Lance, for he carried himself like a warrior, and the banners that flew from the lances of his riders flashed red and white like warning clouds before a storm. He rode into the heart of our camp without fear. 6 men followed him, their coats the color of blood, their helmets like the rising sun. They passed their pickets like water flowing past stones. They did not speak of peace with whispers or hide behind papers. They rode in plain, their heads high. Walsh sat his horse like he was born in the saddle, proud and still. He did not bring soldiers to fight. He brought law. He brought the Queen's word. At the council fire, he spoke to Sitting Bull and to the gathered headmen. His voice was clear, and it carried through the smoke like a hawk's cry. "You are under the Queen now," he said. "This land is hers, and all who live upon it live by her law. If you obey, you may stay. If you defy, you must go." He said there would be no more crossing the line they could not see to hunt the buffalo. No more raids, no horse stealing, no war. "You must be as the Canadian tribes," he said, "who have made treaties and walk in peace beneath the crown." But he did not come only with rules, he came with a promise, and in that promise was something rare, a kind of respect. "Obey," he said, "and the Queen will protect you. Her peace is for all her children, red or white." That day, some were unsure. They watched him like they would watch a strange animal, not knowing if it would bite or run. But Walsh did not flinch, and when a man named White Dog, an Assiniboine, rode into camp with stolen horses, Walsh stood before him like a mountain. "These are not yours," he said, and he dragged the iron chains out into the open for all to see. The Assiniboine backed away like a wolf from fire. The people saw then that Walsh was no fool and not a coward. He meant what he said. Gall was not in that camp by Pinto Horse Butte. His lodges stood further off, perhaps still trailing behind the great crossing or waiting in the high country. But the words of Long Lance spread fast on the wind, and Gall heard them. He was no longer just a warrior chasing glory. He had seen too many winters, too many children buried, too many empty bellies. His hands, once full of weapons, were now full of responsibility. He was a leader of families, of old men, of young hunters, of mothers, with babes on their backs. And so Gall listened, not with his ears alone, but with the part of a man that sees beyond the next battle. He did not trust easily, not after what had been done to the treaties in the South. But he watched Walsh, and he waited. And, for a time, he believed the redcoat might be different, that this Queen's Land might be a place where his people could breathe without the boot on their necks. But always the hunter watches the herd, and Gall kept his eyes on the horizon. He knew that no peace lasts forever, not when it is born in exile and the people grow hungry. In those early days, the buffalo were still plenty. The people danced the sun dance at Wood Mountain. They sang the old songs, and they believed they could live in peace, even in a land not their own. But it was not to last. By the time the snows melted and the rivers ran full with spring water, the lodges had multiplied like new shoots after a prairie fire. What had once been a scattering of exiles became a swelling nation in the north. The Oglala came, tired, hardened men who had followed Crazy Horse into war and after his death into the unknown. Some said his spirit had pointed them northward into grandmother's land before he fell beneath the soldier's knife. Leaders like Big Road and Little Hawk brought their bands across the invisible line, their faces weary, their hearts carrying the dust of betrayal. They came not only for freedom, but because they had nowhere else to go. The Americans wanted to tame them. The Canadians would not feed them. But the open grasslands still held breath. And, for a moment, that was enough. Soon, there were 800 lodges standing in the rolling country south of the Cypress Hills and east of the Wood Mountain. Fires burned at night. Drums spoke to the sky. Children ran among teepees. The Lakota, Oglala, Miniconjou, Hunkpapa, Sans Arc had gathered again as a people, though their homeland lay far behind them. But the land, like the body, has limits. The buffalo, once thick as the stars, began to vanish. They turned their backs on grandmother's land and drifted southward, following old paths and ancient instincts. Some said they were being driven away by the scent of powder and iron, by the noise of strange wagons, and the endless hunger of white hunters who killed for tongues and hides and left the rest to rot. The people watched the herds dwindle and then scatter like leaves before the wind. And then the hunger came. Not suddenly, like a storm, but slowly, like a shadow. At first, it was just fewer robes, then fewer full bellies. The old ones began to thin. The children cried longer in the night. Mothers turned their eyes to the horizon and waited for what would not return. Gall saw this, and he did what he had always done. He acted. He took up his rifle and led small parties south of the line into Montana, where the buffaloes still roamed, where the old hunting trails crossed the Missouri and the Sun River. He did not ask permission, for hunger does not seek approval. The mounted police had warned the Lakota, cross the border, and your sanctuary may be lost. But what is law to a starving child? Gall crossed quietly, moving like the wind through the coulees and dry riverbeds. He did not raid. He hunted like his fathers before him, bringing back meat and marrow, bone and hide. If the Queen's law forbade it, then so be it. He followed the law of survival, and in doing so, honored the spirit of the buffalo. But not all were so careful. Some of the young men, sharp with pride and dulled by hunger, rode south not for meat, but for honor. They took horses. They skirmished with settlers who tried to defend their property. They fought not because they hated, but because they were desperate. And the white settlers, already afraid of the name Sioux, cried out for soldiers. The mounted police, once admired for their fairness, began to harden. The patience of Ottawa began to wither, and the line that once seemed a road of peace now became a wall. Gall understood this too. He watched as the line between survival and provocation blurred, and the whisper of reprisal grew louder. But still, what choice did the people have? A man cannot feed his family on promises. The land had been full, but the buffalo had left it. And where the buffalo go, the Lakota must follow. Sitting Bull tried to hold the people together as the circle of hunger tightened and the wind grew bitter. He walked the camps like a father among his children, stern, proud, and full of belief that the old ways could still endure in this new land. But the old ways were fading like smoke in winter air. To maintain order, he turned to one bull, his sister's son, a young man wise beyond his years. One bull carried out the work of the Akichita, the soldiers of the people, tasked with enforcing the Queen's law across the scattered camps. It was not an easy task. The people were proud, and hunger sharpens the tongue. Even Sitting Bull's own kin were not spared. His wife's younger brother, Gray Eagle, was caught in a web of misdeeds, accused of stealing horses from a white trader. Perhaps it was done from need, or perhaps pride, or perhaps just the wild spirit of youth. In any case, justice came quickly. Sitting Bull, torn between the law of the Queen and the pleas of his family, gave Gray Eagle over to the soldiering society. They tied him to a tree and made him fast without food or water. Some said shots were fired above his head to scare him straight. Others whispered that he was nearly handed to the redcoats. No matter the truth, the punishment left its mark. Gray Eagle never forgave the shame. He carried it like a wound deeper than any knife. and the people began to murmur, "Are we Lakota, or are we prisoners in another man's land?" They asked. "What is freedom, if we must chain our own sons to trees?" While this unrest grew, Gall remained quiet. His camp stood apart, a little west of the wood mountain, nestled in the folds of forest and high ridges. He watched the horizon the way a hawk watches the wind. He did not speak much at councils. He listened. When he crossed the border to hunt, he did so silently, always returning with meat, never with trouble. But something was stirring inside him, something older than exile and deeper than loyalty. He had followed Sitting Bull through glory and through loss, but now he saw a leader clinging to memory while the people wasted away. And then, one day, under a pale sun above the Milk River, Gall met a man who would change his course. His name was Fish Allison. He was a scout, a cattleman, and a drifter between worlds. He spoke the Lakota tongue well and came with a herd of beef, driving them for the white men along a trail that shimmered like a ghost path through Montana. He greeted Gall not as an enemy, but as a brother. He gave meat to the hungry ones. They shared a fire and spoke into the night. "Surrender," Fish said, "is the only path. You will not live through another winter here. Come back across the line. I will help you." Gall said nothing at first. His face was carved in silence, but he listened, and in that silence, a decision began to form like frost on the grass. Soon after, Fish rode north to ruined timber, where the Lakota had built their winter camps among the bare trees and broken ridges. It was a lonely place. The smoke curled thin from the lodges, and the children's laughter had grown quiet. Gall welcomed Fish like a friend. They smoked together. They spoke again of peace, of food, of survival. But Sitting Bull refused to meet him. He would not speak with the white man, no matter what tongue he spoke. His pride stood taller than the trees. He believed that help must come from the Queen's men, especially from Walsh, the redcoat, who had once given his word. Still, Gall made plans. He met Fish again, south of the border. He agreed to send families across the line, not warriors, but old men, women, and children, as a sign of good faith to the soldiers at Fort Buford. He hoped that Sitting Bull, once he saw that the Wasatchew meant no immediate harm, might change his heart. He still wanted to speak with his old friend one last time and bring him into the circle of peace. But news travels fast in the wind. When Sitting Bull heard of Gall's plans, the camp erupted in anger. He called Gall before the people, and his voice was like thunder. He accused him of betrayal, of breaking the unity of the people in exile. Gall listened in silence. He had taken harsh words before. He had endured greater losses, but he did not bow his head. He stood tall before the gathered lodges, a man no longer just a war chief, but something more, something heavier. And he said, "I will lead. I will not watch our children die in the snow. I will not wait for promises that never come. Those who want to live, follow me." There was no ceremony, no singing, just the sound of people gathering their things and the quiet grief of a people divided. And so the path of the exile split again. One trail led back into the teeth of the winter, the other across the line toward a bitter peace. Some say it was a great quarrel, fire and fury, with voices raised beneath a dark sky as if thunder itself had cracked between two men who once rode side by side. Others say it happened with quiet words spoken in a ring of elders where the pipe passed slowly, and the silence between each puff carried more weight than the words themselves. Men like Crow King, Fool Bull, He Dog, No Neck, and Big Road were there. Some say even One Bull stood nearby, torn between the old loyalty and the growing desperation of the people. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but what matters is this: Gall broke away. Not in anger alone, but in resolve, in the stillness that comes after too many winters without hope. The first to follow him were 23 lodges, they say, men, women, and children who packed what they could and followed Gall's shadow southward. But they were only the beginning. As the days grew shorter and the cold began to bite through worn buffalo hides, others began to stir. Hunger has a voice of its own, and it speaks louder than speeches or visions. Soon, the migration became a flood. Lodge by lodge, band by band, they followed the trail of Gall's moccasins across the invisible line back into the country that had once been home and had become a graveyard. By the time the first snows settled on the prairies like a pale blanket, more than 600 lodges had crossed into the United States, leaving behind the exile's dream and the ashes of what might have been. Only 200 remained with Sitting Bull, 200 lodges, stubborn and proud, still holding fast to the memory of Walsh, the promise of the Queen, and the sacredness of refusal. But the road back was not lined with open arms. When Gall reached Poplar River on the Missouri's winding course, he found not relief but command. Major Ilgus, a military man with eyes like flint and orders from above, gave Gall no time to rest. He demanded that the people march at once through deep snow, over frozen trails, in the heart of winter, to Fort Buford, many days away. The people were tired. Some were ill. The journey from the north had already taken much from them: meat, warmth, spirit. Gall protested. He told Ilgus the people needed rest, shelter, medicine, but the soldiers' ears were cold like the weather. He would not bend. And so Gall, who had stood at the Little Bighorn with fire in his blood, now stood in snow up to his knees, leading a column of exhausted people toward a place they did not know, for reasons they did not fully understand. On January 9th, 1881, they reached the gates of Fort Buford. Gall said little when they arrived. He was not a man for ceremony, but those who looked upon his face that day said the pain was plain to see, the ache of a man who had carried the lives of many on his back and knew now that the weight had not yet lifted. He had chosen to survive, but not to surrender. And yet, the surrender came, not with a battle, not with fanfare, but with the slow extinguishing of all other choices. Back in Canada, Sitting Bull lingered like the last leaf clinging to a winter tree. The grass had turned brittle. The buffalo had vanished. And the new commander, Major Crozier, was not Walsh. He did not carry the spirit of honor, nor did he offer warmth. He offered only words, and words without food cannot feed the people, the Canadian government, far away and indifferent, gave no treaty, no annuities, no land, no future, only silence. And in that silence, Sitting Bull waited. But even the strongest branch bends beneath the weight of an empty belly, and, though he still stood proud, the days of resistance were closing like a fist. Gall, having made his choice, watched from the other side of the border as the shadow of surrender moved like a slow storm across the last Lakota lodges in Grandmother's Land. In the end, it was not the sound of rifles or the threat of soldiers that brought Sitting Bull back across the border. It was hunger and the quiet, persistent kindness of a man named Jean-Louis Lagarre. Lagarre was a French-Canadian trader, not a warrior, not a politician, but a man who had known the Lakota since their first days in Grandmother's Land. He had shared their food and their stories. He had watched their children grow thin, and he had not turned away. When the Queen's men turned cold, when the mounted police refused to help, and when the prairie offered only frost and silence, it was Lagarre who opened his storehouses. He fed the hunk-papas when no one else would. He gave what he had because his heart told him it was right. And Sitting Bull, proud and unyielding though he was, could not ignore this mercy. The lodges were few now. The people who once followed him by the hundreds had dwindled to a handful. The rest had followed Gall, had gone to the agencies, or had scattered like leaves. He had held the line longer than anyone. But now the wind had shifted. Even the earth seemed tired. And so, after nearly 4 years in exile, Sitting Bull agreed to return. He did not ride in glory. He did not ride with painted warriors at his side. He came on a gaunt pony, its ribs showing like fence posts. His head was wrapped in a cloth to ease the pain of an eye infection that had spread like fire through his face. He wore no feathers, no war paint, just an old calico shirt and a blanket worn with dust and time. Behind him came the remnants of his people, 40 families packed into wooden Red River carts, creaking over the prairie like the last echo of a song. They had tied their hopes to wagons, to wheels, to strangers. They followed him in weariness. On July 19th, 1881, they arrived at Fort Buford. There is a story the old ones still tell, passed down like a prayer whispered beside the coals of a dying fire. They say that when Sitting Bull arrived at Fort Buford, gaunt and silent, riding a pony whose bones pushed through its skin, he did not dismount right away. The soldiers watched him closely. Reporters scribbled in their books. And then, slowly, the old chief looked down, not at the men in blue, not at the fort walls, but at the small boy who rode beside him, Crow Foot, his son, a boy not yet touched by war, but born beneath its shadow. They say the boy's eyes were wide with the weight of knowing something sacred was about to happen, though he may not have fully understood. Sitting Bull reached across the saddle, and from beneath his worn blanket, he pulled out a rifle. It was long and old, the metal dulled, the wood scarred. It had been carried across rivers and through snow, through skirmishes and sacred hunts. Some say it was the same rifle he held at the Little Bighorn when the bluecoats fell like stalks before a scythe. Others say it was not the rifle itself, but what it symbolized: the last defense of a people, the last refusal to be broken. He placed it into the hands of Crowfoot, slowly, deliberately. And the boy, small in the saddle and wrapped in a tattered blanket, slid down from his pony. He walked forward alone, each step soft upon the earth, each one marking the end of something no one could name, but all could feel. He approached the soldiers at the gate and held the rifle out before him. He did not speak. He did not need to. The gesture was everything. In that moment, the rifle passed from the hands of resistance to the hands of surrender. But more than that, it was the handing over of a time, a spirit, a way of life that had ridden the plains like the wind for generations. A world where a man was free to ride until the stars faded, where the buffalo gave themselves willingly, where prayer and survival were the same breath. That rifle, whether it had fired at the Little Bighorn or not, carried the memory of all those who had fought for survival, for the rhythm of the old songs, for the circle of the people. It was not just a piece of iron and wood. It was a story, a ceremony, a farewell. And when Crowfoot handed it to the white soldier, the sound of it was louder than a gunshot. It was the sound of the last warrior laying down his arms, not because he had been defeated in battle, but because the world he fought for was gone. The sun was high, but something in the air said twilight had come. That is how some remember it. The boy stepping forward, the old man watching with eyes heavy from visions and years. The wind like spirits had gathered to witness a final offering from a nation that would not vanish, but would never again be the same. So it was that both Gall and Sitting Bull, two pillars of the people, returned from exile, not as warriors, but as survivors. One had chosen to return early for the sake of the children, for the warmth of fire, for the breath of the people. The other had waited, holding tightly to the last thread of the old world, hoping still that the sky would part and the buffalo would return. They never stood side by side again as they once had. The wind that once bound them now blew in different directions. Their friendship, once strong like braided rawhide, had frayed, not from hatred, but from the weight of time and choices made. But both had carried the people through storm and silence. Both had led. And though they walked different paths, each moved in the name of the Oyate, the people. Even now, to hear their names stirs my heart. One rides steady and low, the other lingers high, like the cry of an eagle in the morning. Pizi, the man that goes in the middle. Gall, Tatanka Iyotake, the buffalo bull who sits down on its haunches. Sitting Bull. Their footprints remain, pressed into the earth we still call home.
Thank you for riding with us through this chapter in the life of Gall, a man who bore the weight of his people through the long winter of exile. As always, we've worked to stay true to the historical record, drawing from primary accounts and oral histories, while weaving in storytelling elements to bring the past to life with clarity and heart. If today's episode stirred something in you, if you learned something new or simply enjoyed the ride, please consider leaving us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. It helps others find the show and keeps these stories alive. And next time, the fire doesn't fade, it just changes shape. Gall returns, not to the battlefield, but to a new kind of war. One fought with ink instead of arrows. One where allies may be more dangerous than enemies. A new name enters the story, James McLaughlin. And with him, the long struggle between assimilation and identity begins. This has been Chronicles of the Old West. Join us next time for Episode 7 on the life of Gall. Thanks for listening.